be doing both at the same time. So I'm going to be reintroducing our wonderful guest. So to everyone out there on Zoom or on YouTube, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you join us here on the Rabbi Interviews. As today I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing not only a wonderful person in our community, but a friend of mine. This is, of course, Reverend Young. Do you go by Reverend or Pastor? Which is better for you?
I don't really use Reverend, so Pastor is probably better.
Pastor Young. He is married to Mrs. Tracy Bedford Young, and they're both natives of this wonderful city of ours. They have 3 children. She is a graduate of Bennett College, but he is a graduate of Savannah State and an honor graduate of the Interdenominational Theological Center of Atlanta. Hope I got that right. He also completed his Doctor of Ministry at the United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and the Summer Leadership Institute of the Harvard Divinity School, focusing on community and lay leadership development. I haven't heard of that school, but I'll look it up, the Harvard Divinity School. I don't know, it sounds like a little nothing thing, so I'm not that impressed. He has served in Christian ministry for 25 years. He began at the age of 24. I just gave away his age, but he looks so much younger, as we know. He served at Bryce United Methodist Church outside of Columbus, Ohio. He has also served at a variety of other places. He served at Epworth UMC, which is now the New Covenant Church. And then he came here in 2017 to Mosaic Church, which is actually now New Covenant Church, which had changed its name from Epworth UMC. I hope I got that right. He's an adjunct faculty member at South University, and he is on a variety of boards and other things because he does so much on in this community. So welcome to the Reverend Dr., but really Pastor Young, who I accidentally, we were going to lunch on Thursday. He called to cancel the lunch. So I thought he was canceling this, so I got somebody else on. So let me say, send my apologies to Sushi Saucy, who I'm interviewing in a couple weeks, and she moved herself up. So we are so privileged to have you on our program. We're going to talk a little bit about you, a little bit about your congregation, a little bit about the stuff you are doing in town. I want to welcome Jeff. He is online, and I'm sure he'll have some very good questions. So welcome. Looking good.
Thank you, Rabbi. Glad to be here. Honored, humbled to be one of your invited guests. Thank you very much.
And it's amazing because you do look really young for your age. So it's hard to believe that you've been doing this for 25 years. That is pretty impressive.
I am 50 years old.
And that is a young person. And if anybody doesn't know what the definition of a young person is, it's someone who's one day is either my age or younger. So if you're one day older than me, you're considered old, and it just moves online.
Yes, sir.
What year did you graduate high school? Are you 88?
1988.
I'm 87, so we're right around the same age. So let's talk first about when you grew up. You grew up in Savannah, right?
Correct, I did.
What was it like growing up in Savannah, and what led you into this field?
Savannah was I grew up in the 70s, came to age in the early 80s. So Savannah, I loved it. I loved growing up here. Had and have great friends. Savannah was definitely a city in transition. One of the big transitions I remember was when West Broad Street became Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. I literally remember the day that happened. And so Savannah was just a great place for me to grow up, and I'm thankful for having been reared here.
What year was that? Was that when you were a little kid? Was that in the 80s? Because I don't know.
That was in, I want to say, I remember the day, I don't remember the year. I want to say it was in 82 or 83. Okay. I was in middle school.
Very cool. And so you enjoyed growing up here. And what high school did you go to, by the way?
Alfred Eli Beach.
All right. So you went to, which is a very prominent high school still today.
Yes.
And then you have siblings in town also?
Actually, two of my 3 siblings live in town. My younger brother lives in Brunswick. My 2 sisters both live in Savannah.
Wow. I don't know if your parents are still living, but if they are, that's wonderful to have the grandkids in the same area.
My mother is still living. My father is deceased.
Well, that's why, like we call it a big win these days if you have grandchildren living in your area, since people move around so much in this world.
Absolutely.
So you went to high school here. Did you do anything in high school that would lead us to think you were going in this field, or were you in athletics? Were you in chess club? Were you in,
Not
you
the
know,
chess club. I was not in the
something?
chess club. I need to make that for the record. I was not in the chess club. I actually played three sports in high school, only a little bit of football, but baseball all 4 years and soccer for 2 years. My biggest thing in high school was I was in the band,
Oh, nice.
and I was also class president junior and senior year. And
Wow.
then other things that were just well, one interesting thing is I met who is now Dr. Ann Levette. She was my advisor in 10th grade,
Really?
and she was my advisor for 4-H club. And so I've known her since I was in 10th grade.
That is awesome. For those of you who may not be in our area, she's the superintendent of the school system here. Really nice woman. Hope
Mhm.
maybe we'll get her to interview her as well. So you've graduated, obviously doing very successful things in high school. Lettering in several sports. You're the president of your class 2 years in a row, which is not so easy to do. And then you decide to stay in the city for your undergraduate degree.
Actually, no, that's not the way it
Oh,
happened.
it's not the way. Okay, then I
I
got it
went
confused.
to Atlanta right out of high school. Went to Morris Brown College, and was there for a year and a half. And during the well, let me add a little pause. I joined a fraternity, HBCU fraternity, which is now the big thing that people are talking about. It's been a part of the African American community for over 100 plus years. But I joined a fraternity, and then after I joined my fraternity, I came here and found that my mother wasn't doing so well,
Mm.
so decided to take a semester off and stay basically in Savannah with her. And then just ended up transferring to Savannah State. So for a year and a half, I was in Atlanta, then transferred, did 3 years at Savannah State, and then went back to Atlanta for seminary.
So what's the fraternity, by the way?
Kappa Alpha Psi.
So as you were you that at Savannah State as well?
Yes.
So you helped start it, you said, or was it already there?
No, it was
I was
long
already there.
time. It was already
Okay.
there. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so you came back, and I'm glad to see she's doing. It sounds like she's doing much better now. Hopefully.
She is 77. She is a 77-year-old, but she's okay.
All right. Hopefully enjoying the grandkids. So you came to Savannah State, you got your degree here, and did you immediately go to graduate school, or did you do anything beforehand?
I immediately went to graduate school.
Okay. And how was that? Was it fun? How was Savannah State? How was graduate school in terms of?
Savannah State was awesome. My first year there, I was comparing it to Morris Brown, and the schools just completely different. One's a public school, one's a private school, one's a larger school, one's a very small school, just completely different. So I had a little shifting, but once I really kind of got into the flow of Savannah State, it was great. I enjoyed it. I loved it. I have friends that I went to school there with who are still dear friends to me now. Love the campus, love the school. And both of my parents graduated from Savannah State, and my grandmother. So in many ways, it's probably where I should have been in the first place.
Well, it's also, for our area, a lot of leaders graduated from there. So it's not an automatic in, but it really connects to a lot of people in this community,
Yes, it
which is
does.
nice. And how did you like going to, what do you call it, seminary? I think that's
Seminary,
seminary.
yes.
How would
Um, and I have to say this lightly because I'm at home, my wife is in earshot. But my 3 years of seminary were the best 3 years of my life. I loved it. She was my girlfriend then, but she wasn't the focus. Um, but I have my two best friends I met in seminary, and they've been my best friends for over 25, 27 years. A phenomenal time, both a personal growth, but also I gained a sense of the importance of calling and how that impacts how and who you are to be in community. And it literally changed my life. It was a phenomenal season in my life.
right? And
Absolutely best of my life.
where's it located? It's in Atlanta, right?
It's in Atlanta, actually in downtown Atlanta. It's a part of the Atlanta University Center. The other schools that are there are Morehouse and Spelman, Clark Atlanta University. It's a part of the consortium of education with Emory University in Atlanta. So it's actually the only, but definitely the largest consortium of universities in the world because
Really?
they're all literally within walking distance of each other. I actually took classes at Clark when I was in seminary, and knew a lot of students from Morehouse and Spelman. It was an amazing time in my life.
That's right. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with Atlanta. I've only lived in Savannah. A lot of people will be watching this are actually in South Carolina. A lot of people retired who came here. So a lot of us were not familiar with any of these things. We may have heard of some of those schools. So it's interesting that they're all next to each other. I think of Boston as a place where all schools are next to each other. It sounds like Atlanta even more so, because obviously
I did some time at that little school in Boston,
you do
and it is a lot like that.
that.
You literally could be on one campus and not realize it. It's much like the consortium of schools in Boston.
It's maybe even different because Atlanta, I think, is a much bigger city than Boston. So it's obviously more room to have all of these. And you saved yourself, by the way, when you said that was the best time of my life, when you said my wife was my girlfriend at the time.
She
So at least you,
was.
you
She
saved
was.
yourself. Because if she had become your girlfriend afterwards, then there'd be some explaining to do, I think.
Yeah, she and I have been together since early days, since high school.
So how long have you guys been married now? I think you said
25 years
23 years.
last month, 25 years in
You got married
January.
right after school then.
We actually got married when she was a senior in college. I had just graduated seminary and she graduated about 3 weeks later.
Oh, perfect timing.
Hmm.
That's excellent. So how'd you guys meet, by the way?
It's boring.
Okay,
We met in church. We met in youth group.
you're
When we
preaching to the
were
choir here. That's not boring. That's what's supposed to be done.
I was the president of our youth group and she was the secretary. And our advisor, who's a good friend of ours now, she says, I can't believe you two even speak to each other, much less have been married 25 years.
Yeah,
Because as teenagers, we used to go at it all the time.
that may have been indication there.
Yeah, could
Yeah,
have been.
and you're a pastor. You're not supposed to meet your spouse at a bar. That the best way is through youth group. A lot of the people
Well,
I think who are in our field met their spouse in youth group.
I think people sometimes think I make up the story because it seems like, oh, you guys are so perfect. No,
Yeah.
it's just the way it happened.
Hey, it's great 25 years, and that's wonderful to hear. So what was it like to go from seminary, where I guess you're learning a lot of theoretical stuff, probably got some, real life experience a little bit, but you got to study. So you're not, and then all of a sudden you're going into a church and you have to actually become the minister, the preacher. So what did it feel like to go from that to that?
Um, it was difficult. Um, I grew up and came out of a big congregation here in Savannah. It's always been a big congregation. And I received my calling, my sense of ministry, my sense of community service, my sense of leadership, all in a very large congregation. Well, my first assignment was not a very large congregation. It was actually very small. And beyond that, it was a small rural congregation that had two very difficult things going on. Number one, it had met its entire 100 plus history, had only met once a month. So it was a congregation that met once a month, and the remainder of the weeks of the month, the preacher wasn't there. The preacher was serving other churches, and it was kind of a very much old school itinerant type system where the preacher comes once a month. Well, my assignment when I was sent there was to convert that church to a regular full station congregation. The other challenge it faced was that Atlanta had grown out to where it was. Now, it didn't move, it didn't change, but the growth of Atlanta had grown to them, and it was really being forced to be something it had never known how to be. And that was really difficult to lead in that transition. And we ended up staying there in that community 6 years. And that church is now still a very stable, functioning church. Two pastors between me and the current pastor. That particular minister was elected as that city's first African American mayor.
Oh, wow.
And it was already the oldest African American church in the county, but is also the first church to have its leader become an elected official. He was mayor, served 2 successful terms as mayor, and the church is actually really very strong and very solid now. So I give all credit to the Almighty, but I was there to help that church kind of begin to lean into what its future would be. And it was a difficult time, but it was also a great learning experience for Tracy and I both.
Yeah, and it's great because I'm not, you, so I can say I give credit to you. So without being modest. So it's no doubt, I have no doubt, although I'm sure coming out of school, it's always very difficult, but the trade-off is they got a very enthusiastic young man who was just ready to hit the pavement and do everything. So that's the balance between maturity and coming out.
A little too enthusiastic, I think they would say,
Yeah.
but yeah,
The
I
good
was
thing is when you're right
enthusiastic.
out of school, they understand you're going to make these mistakes and you're going to be
Yeah.
very excited. So why don't you take a moment, if you don't mind, explain the assignment process and how that works, because we're not as familiar with how it works in your denomination.
When we appointed, well, essentially, you have a very stringent set of things you have to do: testing, evaluation, essays, writing. But once you're ordained, then you're kind of what's called put on the table. So the bishop and the cabinet looks at your what's called gifts and graces. What are your skills? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And then by the leading of the Spirit, they try to assign you to a church that you can most impact, but that can also most help and strengthen you. And so when I was assigned to that church, I think it was because I had a reputation coming out of seminary of being a very strong preacher, and that they thought this was a church that would benefit from a strong preacher, but was also a church that had a strong lay system that could actually help mold and craft me
Oh,
for
great.
future ministry. So essentially, when you're out there, they evaluate, look at who you are, what you do, and then an assignment is made. You get an opportunity to kind of talk about what the appointment's going to be. And if everything lines up, you're assigned and you're sent to that church, and you are assigned and sent 1 year at a time. And every year you come back and evaluate how the year is going. And based on that, you're either reassigned or sent somewhere else that may have a greater need for who you are and who you're becoming.
And I guess you grew up Methodist and you wanted to stay in that.
You
Okay.
asked you asked the right questions, but my life hasn't followed the right
Okay,
path.
that's okay.
I did not grow up
Okay,
Methodist.
so
I grew up a whole lot of different things, but it was in the Methodist church because there was some crisis of faith as a teenager and a lot of challenges growing up as a teenager. But the place where I felt the most comfortable always was with my grandmother, and my grandmother was Methodist, and so I found myself gravitating towards going to church with her, and that's where I experienced a
right,
sense of calling to ministry.
that's great. And I think, as far as I know, you're the only person who's ever had a crisis of religion in their teenage years. So, yeah, I know nobody. Everyone I knew
Hey,
was very
lucky me,
founded in their religion by the age they
lucky
were
me.
16. Yeah, and it's never. That's what Jews are. We just by 13, you're done. You know what you're doing. Like you're set. There's no more religious
You are a
discussion.
comedian.
Yeah. So you did wonderful things in this church, and then you went to another church after that, right? And then you came here. How many more were after that before you finally got to come back to Savannah?
I had another one of those crises of faith coming out of that first church. So, and it wasn't really a crisis of my faith. Um, I think again, I was probably too full of myself, and I was an associate, not even associate. I was just on staff at my pastor's church in Atlanta for 2 years, and then after that 2 year period, um, things happened, and a call was issued, a request was made from West Ohio, which is the West Ohio Conference. It's another collection of churches, but in the state of Ohio. And they invited me to come be the first African American person at this European American church that was looking for an African American pastor who was not from West Ohio. And just so happens that they found me, God sent me, and we went there. And while there, kind of learned more about me and the system, and then had the opportunity to start a church. And then that church is still functioning and flourishing. And that was my 6 years in Ohio.
Well, you've got a lot of firsts, which is really impressive for them to
Not
have so
finished
much
either.
faith in you after school to send you to this church that was looking to change right away, which is
Mhm.
not an easy assignment right out of school to make these changes. And then to be taken to Ohio and be another first, that's pretty impressive. So
And the Ohio church was different because, coming from Atlanta, which is a predominantly African American setting, went to Ohio, which was a predominantly European American setting. And though the pastor and the leadership wanted me to come, there was a significant portion of that church that did not, because I was the first African American pastor at that church. And in the first year, they lost about 100 members, which would sound debilitating, but also in that first year, they gained about 100 plus members of color, African American, European, Asian American, Hispanic, just a lot of people of color began to join the church. So that was a difficult first year as well. But that church is now predominantly African American and has done a phenomenal multicultural outreach to that part of Columbus, Ohio. And it's become actually, I think, a much stronger congregation than it was, what was that, 20 plus years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the catch-22s of being the first. You look back and say I was the first, but we know in the moment
Yeah, it
it can be
feels.
very difficult to,
Yeah.
if you want to improve things or change things, there's going to be resistance, unfortunately, even for the better. So you helped that church just like the other ones. And then when did you get the calling or the invitation to come back to Savannah?
That would have been late 2007, and I came here back here in June of 2008. Yeah, June 2008 is when I
You come
actually
back
our family
for
came back to
this
Savannah.
for this position you came back, or did you come
Right,
back for another? Yeah.
correct. I came back for this specifically for the role at what was then New Covenant United Methodist Church. It's now Mosaic. Um, but yes, that's when I came back here in 2008.
How do you feel to be coming back here? Were all three of your children already born by then?
Yes, my
Yeah, they were
youngest
all
one was 6 months old.
right. So came back with your children to your hometown. It must have been very exciting for you and your family, or maybe
Um,
nerve-wracking.
Yeah, sometimes family is better at a distance, but it was exciting. Absolutely, we were glad to be back home in Georgia. Definitely glad to be out of the snow and the cold of Ohio. The church was an interesting. First 2 or 3 years were very difficult. You got to remember there were a lot of things happening in society. In 2008, President Obama was elected as the first African American pastor of America, and this church filled with people who were all 70 plus, having their first African American pastor. And there were a lot of mixed aggressions during that first year that I think I took the brunt of, but they really weren't upset or angry with me. It was with just a change in America as a whole. I had one conversation with one of the leaders, and she went on to become one of our very dearest friends. She said, "Drew, you and Tracy are just so cute. We can't find anything not to like about you." So it was one of those kind of seasons.
That's a
Um,
problem.
yeah,
Yeah, and again, I imagine in that period, depending on your age, that it was a very different reality if you were
yeah,
older and grew up never thinking this was possible, as opposed to someone who was younger who hadn't seen it but thought it was possible. So
yeah.
it's probably a very different world. And
It
so
it was.
you've been there then. This is your 14th year, right?
14th year will begin in June,
Doing
so
okay, so
13
almost
and a
your
half
14th.
roughly.
And so when you came here and you started pastoring to a congregation of people who are mostly in their 70s, you probably hopefully learned a lot and then tried to take it into some not newer directions, but adding on the directions to bring in more people, I'd imagine.
Yes, we did a lot of creative things that those first couple of years. We started a jazz cafe, which was the most radical. We converted the basement of the church into a live jazz spoken word cafe, and that actually was a lot of fun and grew both our music ministry, but also just the coolness of the church. And that was one of the big things we did. The second big thing that we did is we started a preschool, which had been attempted there in the early 70s, but didn't feather out. But it was a difficult time of trying to launch things while at the same time, and I say this with all deference and grace, also having to bury some things. I had the seminal, probably will never have this experience again, charge of burying a congregation while also birthing a
All
congregation.
right.
And I had never even thought of anything like that, but it's what we had to do for about 3 to 4 years when we first got here, because there were some people who literally were just holding on long enough to have their funeral in that church.
Right.
And then there were some people who had just moved to Savannah who were looking for a church that was close to where they just moved to. And trying to merge and marry and meter that was very, very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I think you've just, given the success of any house of worship that wants to be successful ratio, you have to be able to do both,
You got to
because we
find the
know in
balance.
most houses of worship it's mostly seniors, but you need to get the next, because obviously they're retired and have more time, but you need to get the next generation. And I know it was probably really wonderful being back home, but you probably saw a lot of people who said, how can Andrew be my pastor? I knew him when he was a little kid. I'm sure he had a little bit of that as well. Yeah. I know when I was in rabbinical school and I got my first calling, as you would call it, I was in Dallas, Texas, and I'm from McAllen, Texas, which is at the bottom. It's 10 hours away. And when the rabbi said I was going to Dallas, he said, why don't you look happy? I said, 10 hours. I said, Dallas, is only 10 hours away from my mother, and that is still pretty close. So I know
It's
it's okay.
interesting when I came here to Epworth, the church is on Bull Street, and it is literally 9 blocks away from my mother's house.
Is it the same
Nine
house you grew up in
blocks,
too?
same house I grew up in. Yeah.
Well, I can say from everybody I know, because obviously I didn't know you back then, but you have such a reputation in town of being truly what we call a mensch in the Jewish world, which is like a good person, but beyond. So you've done all these wonderful things with your church. Obviously it's growing, you're having people coming in, and of course, unfortunately, people dying, your kids are growing. Then we come to the way we met. I mean, when it comes to Savannah in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of ministers come to know each other who didn't before. We're seeing a lot more of this interfaith, especially not only for justice, but of all areas. And you're, of course, one of the front men for that. And so how's it been for you to see this change, or has it been a change for you? It just seems like it has been for me, but I've only been here, 9 years. You've been here a lot longer.
Um, it's interesting. You are definitely a unique case in my life. Um, and I gotta go around the barn to get to the front door. Um, the Where we lived when we first moved here is or was in the heart of the Jewish community in Savannah. All of my neighbors, both sides, front and back, all the way around, lived, right next door. And I had 2 rabbis within walking distance of my front door for 9 years that we were here. So, my children's best friends were the family that had 3 Jewish children who were the same ages as my boys, right next door. So they're growing up, they were playing with those kids and became good friends. My oldest son and their oldest son went to high school. They actually literally went to high school in the same car for 2 years, driving each other to and from high school as juniors and seniors. So I began to be immersed in the Jewish community as far as the practices of the very staunch Orthodox Jews. One of the most interesting interactions I had, you know, one of our neighbors came, it was late on a Friday night, sun had gone down, and he knocked on our door, which, is what it is. But, someone that you haven't met knocking on your door, sunset on a Friday night and knocking very, adamantly. I'm like, whoa. So I asked my wife to step back. I answered the door and he introduced himself and he said he wanted my wife to come. He needed her in the kitchen. And, with all the cultural things that I have and that I am, I immediately went, whoa, excuse me, what do you mean you need my wife to come to your kitchen? We don't do that. And then he explained that it was Sabbath and that someone had left the oven on and they needed someone to come turn the oven off because we had a 5-minute conversation. And of course she went down and did that. And that began my understanding and reckoning with the fact that I lived in a community of very faith-filled people who were part of a different faith structure than I am. And so I kind of, from that point on, just went through all the cultural absorption I could. So I did Sela meals. I did we did one of the meals at Hanukkah where we were waiting for Elijah to come to the door. I had a conversation with my neighbor across the street who was a psychologist, and her husband was a skin doctor. And so I had all of these high intellectual religious conversations. And so it was like, God is preparing me to do something with this information. Who knew it would be to meet Rabbi Haas and to be a friend of his and be able to be culturally aware and be astute. And so, yeah, all the things that we've done and the different things that we're doing, it's kind of what I do and kind of been crafted to do since I was a teenager. But it's good to have met someone like you who also has a heart for people and community, regardless of religious background or culture. So it's been a wonderful getting to know you. And I apologize for the long story to get to that very funny point.
This is all about interviewing you. So and I'm just thinking to myself, except for people who are Jewish, if you tell that story, it's going to sound terrible.
It makes no sense.
If you're Jewish, you're going to know exactly what's going on and just start laughing because you can tell it. So I apologize that you have that immediate experience, but yeah.
It wasn't bad. It required me to recalibrate.
Yeah. I'm in the Reform community, so we're not as, we don't
Yes.
follow all those rules as specifically, so we
Mhm.
would not have that same issue, but it would be pretty interesting to be there when that happened. And
It made me sensitive to the differences of which I did not know.
yeah, it's a lot about language and how you
Yeah.
phrase things,
Yeah.
and that is a good point. And Jeff and Flossie, I see, are laughing as well because they see that I think they're thinking the same thing, that it's really the different way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And so now you have gone from just, I mean, obviously when you first came here, you were pastoring for your church. I'm sure that was the central part of your life along with your family. Now, what are you looking to do, obviously, during the pandemic and after the pandemic for your church and for your community?
Well, I think the biggest thing that for us, we have to realize that church has changed. It is different now forever. I don't think you can even say that we can even go back to church being just a collection of faith-filled people, because reality is a lot of people not only are experiencing grief and loss, but are actually experiencing life differently. This whole past year has given us a completely different gaze on community, family, life, values, principles. And if it hasn't, it should. For me, it has, and it should. Um, so the question for us, or for me, is how do we collect people of faith together for service, for outreach, for personal reflection and faith formation? How do we collect them together in the midst of having gone through a year where many of them have lost people suddenly, who may have now sicknesses that they never had before, they now must work with or deal with for the rest of their lives? How do we even talk about death? How do we talk about life after death? How do we talk about family? Because this pandemic, as I'm sure it did in the 1920s, 1920, when the last one happened, has changed the way I think we see life and community and family. So my hope, my vision is that we can ride that wave and be a place where those conversations can happen and where those interactions can be germane and be authentic. But because our church is actually formed and called to be a church that's multiracial, and a church that's is called to be a mosaic of people. Our motto is many background, many cultures, one community. How do we do even that in the midst of all these other things that are now so significantly different? I've always been accused, and I humbly say, as being an intellectual. I think through things. Well, how do you think through all of this at the same time, while at the same time building community? I think the books, the experiences, the dissertations that are going to come out in the next 5 to 10 years are going to be life-giving and truth-telling for, I think, all communities of faith, because the world is different now.
And that's really the question for our age, is how do we answer God with this new world? What do we
Mhm.
do to keep our community together
Yeah,
and to go forward while connecting to the past, but not dwelling on the
yeah,
past?
yeah.
And thank goodness for me. I mean, I've never been accused of being an intellectual, so I'm very happy about that. That's thank goodness. Never want that to be part of my life. So
You and I are going to talk offline.
so now, one of the reasons I invited you here is because we've come to know each other over the last couple of years, because we're working together with a group of houses of worship during the pandemic, which of course has made it a lot more difficult for social justice. And you've been one of the leaders of this, and I know will be in the future as well. What have you seen with this new organization, and pre-pandemic and during pandemic?
I think what I've observed, and that's a great question. What I've observed is that the things that people used to choose to isolate themselves, they have decided not to. I think gender, race, sexual orientation, practices, I think the things that we used to say we're going to be in our different camps, I think the pandemic has said, leaders, you have people who are hurting, who are sick, and who are dying. All those other choices you made, or reasons why you cannot work together as people of faith, need to be dropped. One of the things I've gotten in somewhat theological trouble with is that I've always said, and this is when I've pastored all African American congregations, when I pastored in a European American congregation, when I'm pastoring as I am now in a multiracial congregation, I've always said those people who tell you that Christians and Muslims and Jews should be in different camps don't really know scripture, because the reality is Jews and Christians and Muslims are cousins. We are birthed from the same faith tree, and that if we realize that we have more alike than we do that are different, I think we literally could change the world. And I've gotten a lot of pushback from that, but it's right there in the Torah, or in the first part of the Bible, in Genesis and even in Exodus and Deuteronomy, that these faith practices come from the same stem of Abraham. And that if the three of those faith structures could figure out how to love together, then the rest of the world, I think, would follow their lead. And I think, again, this pandemic is forcing us to get back down really to the root of who we really are supposed to be, and that's people of faith. And one of the things I've seen emerge throughout this, and you're talking about the Rise Coalition, a couple of other coalitions that I'm a part of, and a couple that you and I are a part of, is that people are maybe starting to get it that we're supposed to be people of God, and anything else that comes after that is something that we've added on to the requirement, not that God required. And so that, we are called to find ways to help people together. And I am just glad that people like you and some of the others have realized that it's really more important that people are cared for than our personal preferences cared for.
And I think that's very well put. And what I enjoy about it is you get all of these different ministers, pastors, imams, and rabbis together who have very different views on a lot of things that really make the news. In the news, it's generally like, what are the differences? Let's really pound those differences and make it seem like 97% of our views are different. Whereas it's the exact opposite. 97% are similar, and it's the 3% that they're always, pounding in the news. And when we get together these groups, we ignore that 3% altogether. We're not trying to promote our view. We're not trying to change your view. If somebody says something accidentally, then we say, listen, we're not talking about that right now. And it's really been a way to bring people together. And I think you said it beautifully. Before we get to the next last couple of questions, I'm going to see if Jeff, Flossie, or Terry, who are online, have any questions for you. Flossie,
hi, guys.
Please.
Hi, everybody.
Hello there. Thank you for your time.
Oh, absolutely.
My question fits in very much with what you're saying, Pastor. I'm of the 60s generation, and I remember with a lot of the marches and a lot of things happening. And I wonder if the average African American today sees how much Jews were part of the civil rights movement. And how do I think you know what I'm trying to say. So many, like you said, are going into their own camps. And I just wonder if it's remembered, and it's still today, but I know how much it was years ago.
Flossie?
Yeah, that's
okay. I think that's a very astute
really
question.
Florence, but you could say Flossie. That's
what I have up there, Flossie.
Okay, all right.
Flossie is more fun.
Yeah, well, I sound like dental floss.
She prefers Flossie. Florence, only her dad calls her, or myself when I'm angry at her.
Flossie sounds like someone you could go out and have a really fun time with a group of people dancing and listening to music.
Well, I'm on pick a night.
She lives her name. You are right. She lives her name.
Okay. On your question, one of the things that is, you ask, if we still remember, one of the things that I've learned, and I'm kind of teaching someone to do in the conference. We're doing a very similar type of extended study on becoming anti-racist. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is look at some of the pictures of the marches. Oftentimes when people are locked up in arms in arms, if you expand out and take the wide view, there is never a picture of Dr. King and those who led in the civil rights movement where there aren't Jewish people on the front lines in almost every single picture, because he intentionally wanted to paint a picture of people from multiple backgrounds and faith practices in those lines. And so you had the Baptists and the Methodists, but you also had the Episcopalian, and you had the Catholic, and you had the Jewish, and even some you had some Arab people based on what they were wearing. So it's always been a visual part of the civil rights movement that people of other faith practices and backgrounds, and I don't like to think of it this way, but racial skin colors, I think race is a made up construct, but it's always been a visual part. Now, as far as intellectually or spiritually, I think those who are really willing to be honest about both the history and the practice of the civil rights movement would have to accept that Jewish people were always a part of the movement. I mean, one of the most referred deaths in the civil rights movement was of the three people killed in Mississippi, one of which was Jewish. And that's fact. I don't believe in this, having alternative facts craziness. It's a fact. It's true. So Jewish people in America actually gave their lives for the change that began in the 60s. I don't think we still haven't finished it, but change in the 60s. So I think those who are intellectually honest can't come to any other conclusion other than Jewish people have always been a part. And as Rabbi said, I think those made up conflicts are really made up in media and made up because maybe it sells books or gets more clicks or gets more views. But African Americans, Jewish Americans have always been, and I guess we can be honest here, have always been a part of the substructure of the American society cast as the other. And whenever you cast as the other in America, if you don't form together, you will surely be abolished and torn apart. So I think it's absolutely not only clear and evident, but it's actually very easy to document.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's hope it keeps continuing.
Well,
And going in that
absolutely
that area, what are you hoping to see in Savannah in the future for not only Savannah, but your community and all the other communities in this wonderful area?
I'm excited about the growth that's happening in Savannah. One of the things we researched before we moved back here in 2008 was what was the growth trends and the projections. And when I read and found that Savannah is projected to be over 1 million in population by the year 2050,
Really?
I was like, wow, that's amazing. And to actually not having been here 13 years and watching it happen, because I'm seeing houses and subdivisions and things happening in places where I never thought new construction would happen. East side Savannah, some of the central places up and down Skidaway Island, even out on the islands in the marshes, there are places where actually, if you were there 3 years ago and you went there now, you would be surprised they even figured out how to build in the areas where new construction and new housing and new schools and new things are happening. So that, to me, I'm excited about. I'm also excited about the most recent movement of both the City Council and Chatham County Commission, where the population that Chatham Savannah is finally becoming aware of the options and opportunities of both public leadership, but also private development. So that excites me. I'm excited by the intellectual capital that is finding and choosing Savannah to be home. Georgia Tech having a campus here, Gulfstream expanding, and some of the other higher level employers are choosing to locate here in this area. I'm excited about just the growth and the people who are being brought here. I'm also concerned and worried that some people who have been here all their lives are being displaced without regard. That's not good. And I think that's something that we should work as a community to do better at. But this is just a good time for the city. And I'm honored and thankful that my children had an opportunity to grow up in the town that my wife and I grew up in. They'll soon all be leaving the nest. But I'm just excited that Savannah is becoming what it is becoming.
Yeah, and it's amazing when you come here. I think it is important to do research. You did all that research about statistics. I just researched how many sushi restaurants they had, and they had enough. And then that's why I decided it was okay to apply for this position. But it's a lot of research on my part as well. I wish
Yes, sir.
but I did it. And we're both here for almost the exact same reasons. So, Flossie, you had a question.
Yes, I have one other question. Jeff and I are members here. We live in Sun City in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And we're members of the African American Book Club. And
would you say that one more time, Flossie? I didn't hear that.
I told him we're living in Sun City, and Jeff and I are members of the African American Book Club.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that's fine.
All right. Well, we review books with an African content, but we have speakers and different programs. And if I could hand them your name and your number, would you maybe consider coming out and speaking to them one time?
Do I have to read a book to come?
No.
You just have to come into the country. You have to cross over to South Carolina.
Oh,
It would help
no.
if you write a book. That would be good. Have you written one yet?
That's
Wow.
my question
Jeff,
as well.
I used to like you, Jeff. I have been asked by several people to turn my dissertation into a book. And I have another book, a fictional book that's been in my heart for years. But I swear, if I could ever just get a year off with literally nothing to do, with no children in the home and a wife that was preoccupied, I would definitely do that. I just have not stopped to do it. And you're probably about the third person already this year to ask me about whatever book but I have two that are in my mental hopper. My dissertation is already finished. That's just a matter of converting it for publishing. My second one is an actual, I can kind of tell you, it's a historical fictitious story that asks the question, what would have happened if the lesson had been learned in the civil rights movement, not to integrate, but to become better entrepreneurs? What would have happened that instead of trying to use other services, we created services of our own and expanded what we already had? What would that have looked like 50 years down the line from the 60s and 50s and 60s to current day? And I pitched it to my wife and she thinks it's an amazing idea. So anybody on this podcast, if you do, I'm gonna come after you with my lawyers. I know a lot of good lawyers. But so I do have two books that I'm working on, but I have not written a book. I've written a few articles, but not a book, and I probably should now that I've lived long enough to justify my opinion.
And plus your kids are going to be gone pretty soon. Not gone,
my
but
children will be out.
Flossie
Yes.
again.
I'm trying, I don't
But
want
yes, I'm willing to come, Miss Flossie. I'm willing to come, and anything that gives me an opportunity to get closer to Hilton Head Tangers and take my wife, I'll definitely come.
Well, if you speak there now, you would probably do it via Zoom, I imagine.
I can still send her.
Well, and I have to, I don't do the programming, but another thing for you to consider when Jeff threw out about a book, I know one or two friends that are authors, and the realm they're going in, and especially you being the father of 3 children, write a children's book. It's very much needed, and with your empathy and your relating so much of what you've gone through, it can reach children.
That's
And
interesting.
You don't even have to dedicate it to me. Do it.
But children's books have fewer pages. That may make it easier. That's actually a very good idea.
If you have more time, I know the COVID situation hasn't made it easier, because I find the rabbi has to do more work during that situation, because
we're meeting every Wednesday.
Once a month. We seek to see him at least 3 or 4 times a week. And before COVID, that wasn't the case. I mean, if we would get in maybe 2 times a month for services. We don't live that far from Savannah, and we consider ourselves part of the Savannah community, but we do have to cross the river to get there. Mm-hmm. But it's an amazing city, and we've only been down here 5 years, and we've been very impressed with the things that take place in Savannah, and we certainly do enjoy it. Is your church back to live in-person services?
No, not yet. We actually just had a conversation about that last week, and we are going to be coming back around Lent, Easter. Preferably by Easter, we'll be back every Sunday. We had our first test pilot weekend or Sunday experience this past week, and we're evaluating that. And I think the congregation did pretty well. Our sanctuary is situated as such where we can actually spread out currently. It's one of the few times in ministry I've ever said, well, you know what, I'm praying for low attendance. But we have a large enough congregation that we can socially distance. And even as we're growing, we're still able to do that. So we're not yet, African-American people have been hit very hard by COVID and are in many ways very hesitant. And so are some of our older European-American members and our Hispanic members. So it's baby steps, but preferably by April, we will be back in regular service. That's our goal right now.
Now, I hope your vaccination situation is at least better than ours. I mean, it's been a struggle in South Carolina.
I think it's a struggle everywhere. We have some members who've had the vaccinations, many who have not.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult wherever you are, just depending. I mean, obviously, if you're in the 1A or B group, you have a better chance, but there's a lot who have, and I know a lot of people, it's just luck. I called just talking to my uncle and aunt in San Antonio. They're both over 70, and they called and found a place an hour south. They're in a big city, San Antonio, and they went there and they got it.
Yeah.
But the other people are not so lucky.
We drove an hour and 40 minutes up to the Charleston area to get ours because we couldn't get anything local. But what about, obviously you are both younger, but one of the categories I didn't notice was that the ministers, along with healthcare workers, because you're caring to your flocks, have they opened it up for the ministries, or has there been anything on that?
No.
That should be an area. I mean, I don't know if they're working on that.
Well, they're still debating whether or not teachers should get the vaccination and the vaccine. And I think that's ridiculous. They're demanding schools be open, but they're not demanding insisting that teachers get the vaccine. So I think the priorities have still not yet caught up with realities.
I think the clergy are working like at hospice or in hospitals as chaplains.
Yeah, if you're,
those have. Terry, did you have a question?
Yeah, Terry had a question.
I'm getting mine on Friday at hospice. A friend of mine told me they had 500 shots a week from somewhere, and he got me signed on.
Okay, good.
Again, it's just, and the funny thing is a lot of these places, they end up needing to give shots because they're going to lose it if they don't give it in a certain amount of time. So one of the ways people found it is they go to a place that they know is going to have extras or might have extras. So it's something we're all dealing with, unfortunately, but hopefully the next couple of months, everybody will start getting even more organized with all of these shots.
I have two seminary classmates, one in Tallahassee and one in in Colorado, who both have done the same thing. They have offered their church facilities as vaccination sites. And by doing that, they have been able to get access to the vaccine. And it really is a ministry opportunity that really every church in every community, if you have enough physical plant space, should make themselves available to become vaccination sites. So in that way, your congregations and that clergy person could benefit, but also the greater community, and it could actually expand access for the entire area.
Yeah.
So that's a ministry opportunity. Yeah. I think Terry had a question.
I'm sorry, Terry, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. If you had something,
you know how it goes next Wednesday.
Yeah, good luck with that. And anybody else, before we're going to conclude in a second, but I want to see if Pastor Young, if you have anything you want to add before we finish this wonderful and very interesting discussion, as I knew it would be. Again, for everybody out there, it'll be on YouTube, on our page, Mikveh Israel Savannah page, in perpetuity. Flossie.
Just thought of something, how with what the Reverend and you are saying about Savannah and Georgia, how Georgia came through with the two senators, an African-American and a Jewish
person.
And it's the first time. So it took Georgia to show how we could move along there. I think it was wonderful.
I think that's a great point to point out and to lift up. And I think that's great. And I celebrated that and I celebrate it. But I think the greater challenge right now is there's already been legislation proposed to try to keep that from ever happening again. That the state won't even receive the fact that it's not the state it used to be, that literally legislation has already been submitted in this legislative session, literally less than 2 months since it happened. to make that even more difficult. And I know we use the word oppression and suppression, but this is just simply vote stealing. You know, and this is my personal opinion, not as a pastor or clergy, but as a person. If you want to compete for people's votes, find better ideas and better stances that people can support, not try to eliminate their ability to vote. To me, that is cowardly, it's un-American, and it frankly is disingenuous of anything that we consider sacrosanct in American politics. So yes, it's good there was that collection of effort, but it's terrible that so many people now see that as a threat, not as a great accomplishment.
Yeah,
I was just happy to be part of this momentous election that I tell people never in my life again will I have the kind of influence I had over that short period of time where my vote counted so much as anybody else.
Why can't you? In 2022, you can have the same influence.
I can, but the whole world was on Georgia. No, I'm saying because Georgia had two senator elections at one time. It was deadlocked. They were going to determine the future of the Senate and thus the future of the government over the next 2 years. It's really never happened this way. It was
that will never happen again. You're right.
Convergence of situations. So
right.
My vote always counts, but this particular time, usually when I vote, I don't have every single person I know in the world calling me and emailing me, telling me, don't forget to vote.
How did you vote? Yeah.
And so we'll finish with Jeff, and then we'll finish with
no, it's an amazing period of time, and it really focused on Georgia. It really came home to that. And there were like two separate elections. There was the presidential election, and then it was all about Georgia.
Yeah, two completely different. Yeah.
And I don't want to take any credit for it, but it pretty much is because of me. So that's why. So thank you, Pastor Young. We're going to reset up our time to go to lunch. We're going to go and have some wonderful food at some point. And I apologize again to Sushi out there who was going to come on at the last second. She's going back to her usual spot. Next week, we'll be interviewing Leslie Westmoreland, who is our new president. She is the fourth female president in the 287-year history of our congregation. We look forward to seeing her. Thank you so much again, Pastor Young. Anybody has any other questions, you'll be able to catch them at Mosaic. And again, that was awesome, as I knew it would be. It was amazing. So thank you again. And we'll see everybody next week with the Rabbi Interviews. Stay safe.
Thank you all.